Welcome everyone to this formed T1 V2 sandwich layout build guide. In front of you are most of the parts, with the exception of the side, top and bottom panels. Here we've got the front panel, the rear panel, the top strut, two side struts, the riser bracket, power supply holder, parts of the GPU retention system. This bracket is for the motherboard I/O shield. We've got the power extension cable, the power button, together with a little black piece. We have the long fan brackets and we have the short fan brackets. I will be using the short fan brackets today, as the long fan brackets cannot be used for mounting an AIO to the case, and I will be using an AIO for this build guide. We have the 4.0 riser, which is custom for this case. And finally, we have a collection of small parts. We have some little tabs which can cover up some area of the rear of the GPU, which we'll get into later. We have 4 case feet and we have an arrangement of screws. So we have got some short countersunk screws, we have some long countersunk screws, we have some flathead screws, we have an arrangement of standoffs. If we count from the right hand side, so 1, 2, 3, 4, those are the ones we'll be using for the motherboard. It is normal that one of them has a longer thread. Other standoffs are used at various points throughout the case. You have one very long screw, which is used to mount these two together if your GPU is long enough for that. And that is then mounted with this short screw, which is actually M3.5. This is the only screw in the set that is not M3. Tool-wise, the only part you need is a simple Phillips head screwdriver. I will be using an electric version as well. And some tweezers can be very helpful. I have prepared my working area by removing a few of the items that we don't need right away. Before we do begin, I do want to say, if you see any blemishes on these parts, that's my fault. I have assembled and reassembled this case a few times now. The first step is one of the most crucial. We will now determine what slot size we will be using. You grab your rear panel. You'll see at the top there are 6 mounting holes. And if you grab the top strut as well, you'll see there are 2 mounting holes in the top strut. Combination of these two is what gives you your slot size spacing. So if we start with the strut at the middle of the case, like so, we will be using 3.25 slot spacing. Move over a little, so that the hole that is in line with the body of the top strut lines up with hole number 5. We are in 3 slot mode, 2.75 slot mode, and this process continues all the way up to 1 slot mode. For this build, I will be using 2 slot mode, as I'm using a 3080 FE. We'll secure this to the rear panel using a long countersunk screw. And we will mount it to the same hole on the front panel. We will now be mounting one of the side struts to the case on the GPU side. If you're ever confused which side is the GPU side, simply look at the rear of the case. The barcode is always on the motherboard side of the case. We'll flip the case over onto its side, grab one of the side struts. The side strut has a small indentation on one side. We want the small indentation to be towards the rear of the case. We will insert it like this. And we will attach it using 2 of the long countersunk screws. Next, we will grab the bracket for the motherboard's I/O shield. You will see it has 2 little tabs. The little tabs need to be facing towards the front panel. It has a small recess in it, and this should be towards the top strut of the case. These little tabs connect to the top strut and towards another point later on. So make sure you slide it in correctly. And now the bracket secures to the rear of the case using a short countersunk screw. The next step is to mount the GPU hanger. We will flip the case over. And we have these 2 pieces for use in this. Now it will depend on what size your GPU is, but for 2-slot mode, we only need the large part and the small part is not needed. The large part is mounted to the small recess, is visible over here, using one of the flathead screws. The lines going through it should be parallel with the rear of the case. Don't make this too tight so that it still is somewhat mobile, as this will be useful later on. Next, we will turn the case around and secure the GPU I/O bracket to the top strut using a long countersunk screw. We will now be securing the riser bracket. The riser bracket is secured to the case via a screw to the motherboard I/O shield bracket, as well as via standoffs to the side strut. The amount of standoffs needed depends on the position of the top strut. For 2-slot mode, we only need the 20mm standoff. The bracket is mounted like such, with the parts facing towards the top strut and the opening facing up. We'll flip it over and install standoff. Now this is mounted to the case via a long countersunk screw. We will now be securing the riser bracket to the side strut by flipping the case over and attaching a long countersunk screw here. For the motherboard standoffs, we flip over the case. We have 4 of these, and one of them has a slightly longer thread. The one with the longer thread will be mounted here. Here use the bottom one of the 2 holes. The power button can be installed on either side of the case, either on the motherboard side or on the GPU side. I will be installing it on the motherboard side. To do this, grab the black piece of plastic and insert it through the hole. Next, grab the actual button. You may want to pre-bend the wire and then ensure you angle it correctly so that the white part is facing the black piece you just put in. And the button is secured via 2 short countersunk screws. You are using a 2.5-inch drive. This can be mounted to the front panel using these holes over here. The case has 2 options for mounting the power supply. The standard option secures the power supply bracket to the top strut using these sets of holes. The alternative 90-degree power supply mount mounts the power supply bracket to the holes on the side of the front panel. This does interfere with a 2.5-inch drive mounted here. These are mutually exclusive options. For the default power supply mount, we will grab the bracket. And the bracket is secured, the little tabs are facing this way, to either of these sets of holes. There are 3 mounting locations. You can choose whichever one you prefer. Generally, I would recommend going as close to the front panel as you can. You can secure the bracket to the top strut either directly via some of the flathead screws, or you can use some of your leftover standoffs to push the power supply further away from the rear of your GPU. This is especially beneficial if you are using a flow-through design. I will use the 2 1cm standoffs that I have left over. These mount into the bracket. Secure the bracket, we will flip the case over. Make sure that the tabs are facing towards you. grab one of the flathead screws. You will want to mount your power supply using the screws included with your power supply. For this build, I will be using the Corsair SF750. And you will want to install it with the fan facing towards the side panel. Power supply is not yet fully secured. It has some flex in this direction. There is a recess in the front panel as well as a threaded hole in the power supply bracket. The manual suggests you use one of the flathead screws to mount it into the recess. However, I have found that using one of the long countersunk screws works better for securing the power supply. Make sure to not over tighten it. For this build, I will be using the alternative power supply mount. For the alternative power supply mount, the connectors exit in this direction directly towards the motherboard. As a result, you can use a very short 24-pin cable, like this custom cable I have over here. I would generally not recommend this if you are using stock cables. I would recommend just sticking to the standard power supply mount. The power supply bracket for the alternative power supply mount secures via either of these two sets of holes. You can either use the top set or the bottom one. The bottom one gives you slightly more room for your AIO tubes, but does eat away a little bit at your fan space. There's still plenty of room for a 27mm AIO radiator and a Fantex T30, but it does give you a little bit less breathing room. I will be using the top mount. You will want to ensure that your fan is facing outwards as well. I will secure bracket to my power supply. Before you mount your power supply, make sure the switch is on and that the power supply cable is connected. You'll be using two of the short countersunk screws, and I will be using the top mounting option. That is the power supply secured. Next, we will grab the riser and place it over the strut as such. This is because one of the next things we will be doing is mounting the motherboard. And if you have a back shield on your motherboard, there's a chance that you cannot clear it otherwise. If your motherboard has an AIO shield, now is the time to install it. The motherboard should line up with the 4 standoffs that we installed earlier. And it is secured via 4 of the flathead screws. Connect the riser. We will further secure the riser to the riser bracket using 2 of the flathead screws. Make sure it sits within the riser holder. Next, we will be mounting the power supply cable. I recommend routing it through here and then through the little gap over here between the riser bracket and the side strut. Depending on your chosen slot size, this might not fit, so you may have to loosen these 3 screws to get it through. I will do that now. To secure the power supply cable, we will be using 2 of the long countersunk screws. We will now be mounting the second side strut. For this we will need 2 of the long countersunk screws. There is a good chance that you only have 1 of these left if you use one of the long countersunk screws to secure the power supply to the front panel in a standard power supply mount. If that is the case, I would recommend you replace the long countersunk screw here with a short countersunk screw. If you have it, then we will secure it now. So again, there is a recessed part. We want the recessed part to be towards the rear of the case. And again, we are using the long countersunk screws. Next, we will prepare the radiator or fan half of the case. Again, if you're using an AIO or a radiator, you will want to use the short fan brackets. If you are just using 2 fans, for example, an air-cooled build, you will want to use the long fan brackets. I'm using an AIO. I will be using the short fan brackets. I will start by making some space. Before you attach any fans to your AIO, I recommend you test fit the AIO so that you know how you'll be routing your tubes, where you want which fan, and so that you know how you'll be routing your cables. Additionally, in this case, above the motherboard, there is 46 millimeters of space. A standard AIO radiator is 27 millimeters thick, so you will need at least 1 slim fan. Above the power supply, there is significantly more space, which is why I'm also using a Fantex T30, which is 30 millimeters thick. The short fan brackets mount to the recesses in the side brackets. The short fan brackets are attached to the radiator as such. We have radiator, fan, then the short fan bracket, and that is all screwed together. Position of the short fan brackets requires some trial and error. You can leave the screws for the slim fan slightly loose, they have some amount of travel in them. Additionally, these fans are best mounted as exhaust, so that they can take the heat from the GPU out through the radiator. I will feed my CPU block through. Depending on the GPU slots you have chosen, you may have to remove this side bracket to make this work. To secure the short fan brackets to the side strut, we will be using the short countersunk screws. Next, I will mount my CPU block, for which I will need a little bit of thermal paste. Whenever you are tightening a CPU block, always do it gradually, side by side, to get an even mounting pressure. Now is a good time to plug in your fan headers, route your AIO tubes, and also do not forget to plug in your power switch right now. Now that you have done some of your cable management, double check that your fans still span freely and if they're not getting obstructed by anything. If not, then now is time for the power supply cables. I have added my 24-pin cable and my CPU 8-pin cable. Next, we will be installing the graphics card. To install the GPU, you want to make sure that your GPU I/O bracket hanger is still there and that the clip on the riser is fully opened. Now go ahead and insert your graphics card. Once your graphics card is inserted, you can close the clip on the riser. You can now screw the GPU's I/O bracket into the GPU hanger. You will be using some of the flathead screws and make sure that you tighten the GPU hanger itself as well. I will say, especially in certain builds, this can be very tight, leaving you almost no clearance to actually screw it in. If you have some spare M3 thumb screws from a different build, I would recommend using those. I have now secured my GPU here and here. These two cover plates can be used. These attach to the screw holes over here and they would sit in just like this. They do not work for my GPU in 2-slot mode, but your results may differ. You have two of these because you can do the same up top. One of the main concerns I've seen so far are people are not confident in the strength of the GPU mounting mechanism and the power supply mounting mechanism. At least for the alternative power supply mounting style, I am very confident it is mounted very strongly. I'm shaking the entire table to get it to move at all. And the same is true for the GPU. You can see the entire table is shaking trying to make this happen. Now you should connect the PCIe Power for your graphics card. If you are using a NVIDIA 3000 series Founders Edition card, I highly recommend getting a custom 12-pin cable to make managing the cable significantly easier. I am using a 12-pin extension cable. It spans the length of the case. It is not an elegant solution, but it does work. With your PCIe Power installed, go ahead and double check that all of your fans are still spinning freely. And plug in a monitor, mouse and a keyboard and double check that your system does post. If your system posts, congratulations, your build is almost complete. The next step is going to be to install the case feet. For this we will grab the top or bottom panel. These panels are identical, so the case feet can be installed on either the top or the bottom of the case, depending on how you want it to be oriented. Case feet themselves attach via the short countersunk screws, and you can attach them through any of these 988 holes in the top or bottom panel. To install the top and bottom panels, flip the case, and you'll see that the panel has two retaining tabs which slot into the front panel, and they secure at the rear of the case with thumb screws. Flip your case onto its feet and go ahead and grab your side panels. The side panels slot into the bottom panel. And they should stay in place like so. I'll do the same with the other side panel. It is now time for the top panel. The top panel attaches in exactly the same way as the bottom panel does. However, before you insert it into the front panel, pinch the side panels shut and make sure the panels are fully seated. And voila! Secure with two thumb screws at the rear. Some of you may have noticed that I have a vented acrylic side panel. This is one of the optional accessories. This is what the rear of the case looks like for me. I have access to my GPU, my motherboard, and you may see these little bits. These are part of another optional accessory, the Peak Design handle. there is a similar looping point over here. These are the M19 to G1/4 adapters. These are mostly used for water cooling builds. Your build should now be completed. I hope this was of help to you. If you do have any questions, post them in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. In the video description, I will post 2 image albums. The first will show you what parts and screws to expect in your package. The second has close-up pictures of my first build in the case. There's also a 7-hour video of my first build in the case. I streamed it live on Twitch, where you can follow me as well. Thank you for watching.